Prince Albert Victor was destined to be king until he was caught in private establishments strictly for men. To cover up his unconventional tastes, the royal family buried the evidence. That silence turned Eddy into the prime suspect for Jack the Ripper. Was he a sadistic monster or just a political pawn? The late Victorian era was not just a time period, it was a performance. It was a society obsessed with the appearance of perfection. The British Empire covered a quarter of the globe, and at the top of this vast pyramid sat the royal family. They were not viewed merely as politicians or rulers. They were viewed as moral paragons, the God-ordained example of how a family should look and behave. Queen Victoria, the matriarch in eternal mourning, had spent decades crafting an image of unassailable respectability. The monarchy was the glue holding the empire together, and that glue was made of dignity, duty, and dull, dependable virtue. Eddy was born to inherit this crushing weight. As the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, he was second in line to the throne. From the moment he drew his first breath, his destiny was written in stone. He was to be King Emperor. He was to be the father of the nation. He was to be the steady hand on the wheel. But biology does not respect dynastic ambition. From his earliest days, it was clear that something in the royal machinery had misfired. There was a vacantness to him. His parents, the energetic and charming Prince of Wales and the stunningly beautiful Princess Alexandra, were vibrant social creatures. But Eddy was different. He was a quiet, lethargic child who seemed to exist in a permanent state of fog. The royal tutors, men accustomed to drilling Latin and history into the heads of the elite, found themselves hitting a wall. They wrote desperate letters to his parents, trying to find polite ways to say that the future king was incapable of learning. They called his mind abnormally dormant. They described a boy who would stare out of the window for hours, who could not focus his attention on a single subject for more than a few minutes, who seemed to let information slide off his brain like water off oiled silk. This condition earned him a cruel nickname within the whispered circles of the court, the slow mind. It wasn't just that he wasn't clever, it was that he seemed absent. Some modern historians have looked back at the records and suggested he might have suffered from absence seizures, or perhaps a significant hearing loss inherited from his mother that went undiagnosed, isolating him in a world of silence. Others suggest he was simply born with a learning disability that, in a commoner, would have garnered pity, but in a future king, inspired panic. The courtiers were terrified. They looked at this tall, thin, languid boy with the long neck and the heavy-lidded eyes, and they didn't just see a slow student. They saw the end of the monarchy. How could this man possibly outmaneuver the German Kaiser? How could he negotiate with Parliament? How could he hold the respect of a rapidly modernizing world? The establishment's solution was the only one they knew: force. They tried to mold him. They sent him to Cambridge, hoping the intellectual atmosphere would spark some hidden fire. It didn't. He sat through lectures without absorbing a word, charming but utterly vacant. They sent him to the army, hoping the discipline and the camaraderie of the officers' mess would stiffen his spine. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It introduced him to pleasure. This is where the tragedy of the slow mind begins to turn into something darker. Eddy might have been intellectually stunted, but he was physically active, and he possessed a desperate, aching need for connection. He was a man who felt himself to be a disappointment to his father, a source of anxiety to his grandmother, and a puzzle to his teachers. But in the nightlife of the Victorian underground, he wasn't the slow mind. He was just a wealthy, high-status man with money to burn. The London of the late 19th century was a city of schizophrenia. In the daylight, it was the capital of piety and industry. But when the sun went down and the infamous pea soup fog rolled in off the Thames, the city transformed. The gas lamps flickered over a sprawling underworld of gambling dens, music halls, opium parlors, and brothels. It was a world where desire was the only currency that mattered, and for a prince who felt trapped by the rigid expectations of the daylight world, the darkness must have felt like freedom. Eddy began to drift. He was like a moth drawn to the flame of the illicit. Reports began to filter back to the palace, whispered by police inspectors and private secretaries. The prince was seen in the wrong parts of town. The prince was drinking too much. The prince was keeping company with chorus girls. The prince was accumulating debts. At first, this was dismissed as the sowing of wild oats, a tradition for royal males. His father, Bertie, was a legendary philanderer after all. But there was a difference. Bertie's affairs were discreet, conducted within the high society rules of the aristocracy. Eddy had no such filter. He lacked the cunning to hide. He drifted into the lower classes, into the rougher establishments, guided by a naivety that made him incredibly vulnerable. And then the rumors changed. They became darker. They stopped being about chorus girls and actresses and started hinting at things that could not be printed in newspapers. Things that, in 1880s England, were not just scandalous. They were criminal. Whispers of a forbidden orientation, whispers of men. The stakes were absolute. In the Victorian moral code, homosexuality was not an identity. It was a vice, a sin, and a crime, punishable by hard labor. For a common man, exposure meant ruin. For the future king, it meant the collapse of the dynasty. The establishment began to realize that Eddy wasn't just slow. He was porous. He leaked information. He trusted the wrong people. He was a man who could be blackmailed, coerced, and led astray by anyone who showed him a moment of affection. As the 1880s wore on, the anxiety in the palace reached a fever pitch. They were trying to hide an elephant in a small room. They surrounded him with minders. They planned tours of the colonies to get him out of London. They tried to marry him off to suitable German princesses. But Eddy always drifted back. He drifted back to London, back to the fog, back to the thrill of the secret life. It is here, in this gap between the public image of the Golden Prince and the private reality of the tormented, pleasure-seeking man, that the seeds of the two greatest scandals of the century were sown. The first would explode from a nondescript house on Cleveland Street, threatening to expose the sexual hypocrisy of the entire British ruling class. The second would be even more terrifying, a series of brutal ritualistic murders in the slums of Whitechapel that would forever be linked to the name of Jack the Ripper. The connection between the prince and these events has been debated, debunked, and resurrected for over a century. But what is undeniable is the atmosphere of fear that surrounded him. The people in power knew something was wrong. They knew Eddy was walking on the edge of a precipice, and they knew that if he fell, he would drag the queen and the country down with him. This fear drove them to proactive measures. It drove them to surveillance. It drove them to cover-ups. He was a man loved by his mother with a fierce protective intensity, yet viewed by the machinery of state as a defective product. The psychological toll was devastating. To be told you are everything, yet treated like you are nothing. To be bowed to in the streets, yet spoken to like a child in the study. Is it any wonder he sought solace in the arms of strangers? Is it any wonder he wanted to lose himself in the anonymity of the crowd? But anonymity is a dangerous thing for a prince. When you step off the pedestal, you are down in the mud with the rest of humanity, and the mud of Victorian London was thick with predators. Eddy was a sheep walking among wolves, but he was a sheep wearing a golden fleece. The wolves saw him coming, and the shepherds, the men in the gray suits back at the palace, were watching from the shadows, hands hovering over their weapons, ready to shoot not the wolves, but the witnesses. This is the portrait of the heir as he stood on the brink of the 1890s. A man with a slow mind, but a racing heart. A man addicted to the rush of the forbidden. A man who was the centerpiece of a system that demanded perfection, while he himself was fundamentally, tragically flawed. The stage was set for a collision between the messy human reality of Prince Eddy and the cold, hard steel of the British state. And when that collision happened, the silence that followed would be deafening. The first crack in the dam didn't come from a murder. It didn't come from a state crisis. It came from a seemingly trivial police raid on a house in Fitzrovia, a raid that was supposed to catch petty criminals, but instead caught the reflection of a prince. The silence was about to be broken. The explosion that would rock the Victorian establishment began not in the wretched slums, but on a quiet street in Fitzrovia. Number 19 Cleveland Street was an unremarkable building. To the casual observer, it was simply a house, but to a select group of men in London, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where the suffocating moral laws of the era were suspended, where the strict Victorian hierarchy of class and gender dissolved into the haze of tobacco smoke and forbidden desire. The scandal began, as so many great catastrophes do, with a mistake that seemed utterly trivial. A 15-year-old telegraph messenger boy named Charles Swinskow was caught stealing a few shillings. It was a petty crime, the kind that happened 1,000 times a day in a city rife with poverty. But when the police constable questioned the boy, asking how a messenger on a meager wage had so much money in his pockets, Swinskow didn't lie about the theft. Instead, he told a truth that was far more dangerous. He said he earned the money by going to a house on Cleveland Street. He explained that gentlemen paid him for his time, and he wasn't the only one. The police, led by the diligent Constable Luke Hanks, pulled on this loose thread, and the entire tapestry of London high society began to unravel. They raided number 19. They discovered that it was a male brothel run by a man named Charles Hammond. The commodities on offer were the telegraph boys, young working-class lads in their distinctive uniforms who delivered messages across the city, and it turned out delivered much more to the wealthy men who sought them out. At first, the police treated this as a standard vice case. They interrogated the boys, expecting to catch a few deviants, perhaps a merchant or a clerk. But as the boys began to talk, the atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted from routine boredom to cold, hard panic. The names the boys were spitting out were not merchants. They were the names of the ruling class. They named Lord Arthur Somerset, a major aristocrat, and terrifyingly, the personal equerry to the Prince of Wales. Somerset wasn't just a noble. He was a man who stood at the right hand of the future king. But then the boys went further. They described another visitor, a man of very high distinctiveness. They described a gentleman who was tall, with a long, elegant neck, a small mustache, and heavy-lidded eyes. They didn't know his name, or perhaps they were too terrified to say it loud, but the description was unmistakable. It was the face that had appeared in newspapers and on commemorative plates. It was the face of Prince Eddy. Some reports from the investigation, reports that were later suppressed, lost, or sanitized, suggested that the name Prince Eddy, or the initials PAV, were found in the client ledger kept by the brothel owner. The implication was nuclear. The police were staring at a scenario where the second in line to the throne was not only committing a crime punishable by imprisonment, but was doing so in a sordid house frequented by blackmailers and hustlers. News of the investigation traveled up the chain of command with the speed of a lightning strike. It bypassed the usual bureaucratic channels and landed directly on the desks of the most powerful men in the empire, the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. Imagine the scene in Salisbury's office. These were men who had spent their lives building the image of British moral superiority to justify their rule over India, Africa, and half the world. And now they were looking at a file that suggested the future of that empire was frequenting a male brothel in Fitzrovia. The reaction was immediate and ruthless. The machinery of the state, which we saw earlier as a protective blanket around the monarchy, now transformed into a weapon. The priority was no longer justice, it was containment. They faced a terrible dilemma. They had enough evidence to prosecute Lord Arthur Somerset. The witnesses were credible, the dates aligned. But if they put Somerset in the dock, his defense counsel would ask the obvious question, who else was there? If Somerset went down, he would take the prince with him. The courtroom would become a theater where the deepest secrets of the monarchy were laid bare for the press to devour. So, a different decision was made, a decision that defines the era. The law would be applied with crushing weight to the poor, and it would be suspended entirely for the rich. The telegraph boys, the victims and witnesses, were suddenly the ones under pressure. They were interrogated aggressively. They were threatened. The message was subtle but clear. Keep your mouth shut about the tall gentleman or suffer the consequences. Meanwhile, a tip-off was quietly arranged for Lord Arthur Somerset. He was told effectively that the warrant for his arrest was being delayed just long enough for him to catch the night boat to France. He fled, living the rest of his life in exile, a scapegoat who took his secrets to the grave. But what of Eddy? The tall gentleman couldn't flee to France. He was the heir. Instead, the palace initiated a grand distraction. Just as the whispers about Cleveland Street were beginning to circulate in the radical press, journalists who hated the monarchy were sniffing blood in the water. Prince Eddy was suddenly and conveniently dispatched on a monumental tour of India. It was a masterstroke of public relations. While the police back in London were burying files and intimidating witnesses, the newspapers were filled with glorious illustrations of Prince Eddy riding elephants, hunting tigers, and receiving the adulation of Maharajas. The narrative was forcefully rewritten. Look, the paper said, here is your virile imperial prince conquering the East. Do not look at the dark streets of Fitzrovia. Look at the sun rising over the Ganges. The Cleveland Street scandal is often treated by history books as a footnote, a quirky legal drama. But for Eddy, it was the turning point of his life. It was the moment the establishment realized he was not just slow, but dangerous. The slow mind was not merely a passive vessel. He was a man with active desires that stood in direct opposition to the survival of the crown. The psychological impact of this cover-up was profound. He saw his friends exiled. He saw the police force bent to his will. He learned a terrible lesson, that he was untouchable. No matter what he did, no matter how reckless his behavior, the system would step in to clean up the mess. The Prime Minister would intervene. The police would look the other way. This kind of immunity is toxic to the human soul. It removes the fear of consequence, which is the only thing that keeps most of us in check. Eddy returned from India not chastened, but emboldened. Or perhaps more accurately, he returned more detached than ever. The gulf between who he was, a man who sought affection in the arms of men who craved the thrill of the underground, and who he was supposed to be, the stern, moral Victorian patriarch, had become unbridgeable. He was living a double life, a fracture in his psyche that was widening by the day. And beneath the surface of this royal drama, something physically rotting was taking hold. The rumors of syphilis were not just idle gossip. They offered a terrifying medical explanation for his erratic behavior. If the disease was indeed coursing through his veins, the slow mind was no longer just a learning disability. It was a symptom of a brain under siege. The lethargy, the lack of focus, the drift, these are the hallmarks of the early stages of neurosyphilis. The prince was not just fighting his own nature, he was fighting a biological time bomb. The Cleveland Street scandal was successfully buried. The editors were silenced. The boys were scattered to the winds, and Somerset was gone. The perfect silence descended once again. But silence bought at such a high price is fragile. The public, though deprived of the official facts, knew something had happened. A distrust began to fester in the streets of London. The people looked at the palace and saw not a beacon of light, but a fortress of secrets. They began to wonder what other horrors were being hidden behind those gilded gates. And they wouldn't have to wait long to wonder. Because while the Cleveland Street scandal was a matter of sex and politics, the next shadow to fall across Eddy's life would be made of blood and terror. The suppression of the Cleveland Street story proved that the government would cover up a crime to protect the prince. And once the public believed that, the leap to believing they would cover up murder was a short one. The prince was safe for now. He was back in the fold, shielded by the most powerful men in the world. But the protection of the state is a cold comfort when you are at war with yourself. Eddy was a man walking alone through a hall of mirrors, and the cracks were starting to show. The establishment had saved his reputation, but they couldn't save his soul. And in the darkened alleyways of the public imagination, a new narrative was beginning to take shape. One that would transform the slow prince into something far more sinister. If the Cleveland Street scandal was a sudden, violent explosion that threatened to blow the roof off the House of Windsor, what followed was something far more insidious. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. The establishment had successfully put out the fire, but they could not clear the smoke. Prince Albert Victor, Eddy to those who pitied him. The collar and cuffs to the press, who mocked his fashion obsession, returned to the royal fold, but he did not return whole. He was a man who had stared into the abyss of total social ruin and had been yanked back at the last second by the invisible hand of the state. But you cannot simply save a man like Eddy. You can scrub his name from a police ledger, you can exile his friends, and you can bribe the newspapers, but you cannot scrub the chaos from his own mind. The years following 1889 were defined by a terrifying drift. By his late 20s, the physical and mental state of the young prince had begun to collapse. In a family defined by a ferocious, almost Teutonic energy, his grandmother Victoria was a workaholic recluse. His father Bertie was a social dynamo who could eat, drink, and converse for 18 hours a day. Eddy was a ghost. He was becoming transparent. The slow mind was no longer just a quirky trait of a backward student. It was hardening into a profound pathology. Contemporary accounts paint a picture of a man who lived in a permanent state of lethargy. He would sit for hours, staring at the middle distance, a cigarette burning down between his fingers until it singed the skin. He was described as gleefully apathetic. Nothing mattered. State affairs? Family crises? The shifting borders of the empire? It all washed over him without leaving a mark. To fill this terrifying void of silence in his own head, Eddy turned to the only things that made him feel alive: sensation. If his mind was slow, his appetites were frantic. He became a creature of the night, not in the romantic sense of a vampire, but in the tragic sense of an addict. He drank heavily, not with the jovial excess of his father, but with the grim determination of a man trying to drown a noise in his head. He smoked incessantly, and he continued to pursue sexual oblivion with a recklessness that terrified his handlers. But there is a darker theory that hangs over these lost years, a shadow that historians and medical experts have whispered about for over a century. It is the theory that the slow mind was not just a learning disability, and his dissipation was not just a moral failing. It is the theory that Prince Albert Victor was rotting from the inside out. The 19th century was the golden age of many things: industry, literature, empire, but it was also the golden age of syphilis. It was the great pox, the French disease, a scourge that stalked the Victorian bedroom with the same lethality that cholera stalked the slums. In an era before antibiotics, syphilis was a sentence of death, but it was a cruel, lingering death. It could lie dormant for years, hiding in the blood before re-emerging to attack the organs, the bones, and finally the brain. The symptoms of neurosyphilis, the tertiary stage of the disease, read like a checklist of Eddy's known behaviors in his final years. The cognitive decline, the apathy, the sudden, inexplicable rages, followed by periods of catatonic silence, the tremors, the gout that he frequently complained of, a common euphemism in royal circles for unexplainable pains and swelling, may well have been the body signaling its own destruction. If we accept this hypothesis, Eddy becomes a figure of immense tragedy. Imagine the horror of it. To be the heir to the throne, standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving to the crowds, while knowing that your own blood is poisoned. To feel your mind, the very instrument you need to rule, slowly dissolving into a fog that you cannot claw your way out of. He was a man trapped in a disintegrating body, bound by a calendar of royal engagements he could barely comprehend. And this brings us to one of the most chilling figures in this entire drama, Sir William Gull. To the public, Sir William Gull was a pillar of rectitude. He was the physician in ordinary to Queen Victoria, a baronet, a man of science who had saved the life of the Prince of Wales during a bout of typhoid. He was the keeper of the royal bodies. But in the shadowed corridors of the palace, Gull's role was far more complex. He was the keeper of the royal secrets. If Eddy was indeed suffering from syphilis, Gull would have been the man charged with the impossible task of managing it. In the Victorian era, you did not cure syphilis, you contained it. You treated the symptom with mercury and arsenic, poisons that often did as much damage as the disease itself, and you managed the patient's decline with discretion. Picture the scene: the elderly, stern physician arriving at Sandringham or Marlborough House, his black bag in hand. He's shown into the prince's private chambers. The door is locked. What happened in those rooms? Did Gull see the sores? Did he see the madness flickering in the prince's eyes? Did he administer the toxic treatments while Eddy lay shivering, sweating out the poison of his own indiscretions? Gull represents the cold, clinical interface between the human frailty of the monarch and the iron requirements of the monarchy. He knew that if the public learned the future king was mad with the pox, the game was over. So, a wall of medical silence was built around Eddy. His ailments were described as fevers, chills, or gout. The truth was buried in clinical notes that would never see the light of day, but the slow mind was becoming a public liability. Eddy's behavior was becoming erratic. There were reports of him behaving inappropriately at dinner parties, laughing at the wrong moments, or falling asleep in the middle of conversations. The drift was becoming a nosedive. The establishment began to realize that they were running out of time. They weren't just hiding a scandal anymore. They were hiding a collapse. The tragedy of the slow mind is that Eddy was aware, on some level, of his own inadequacy. There are heartbreaking glimpses of this in his letters, fragmented, poorly spelled, filled with a childlike longing for approval. He knew he was a disappointment. He knew he was the problem. And this knowledge likely drove him deeper into the arms of his addictions. It was a vicious cycle. The shame of his condition drove him to vice, and the vice worsened his condition. By 1891, the situation was critical. The prince was 27 years old. He had no wife, no heir, and no purpose. He was a source of constant anxiety to his grandmother, the queen. The Cleveland Street affair had been buried, but the smell of it lingered. The police were weary of cleaning up after him. The press was beginning to ask pointed questions about why the prince was always resting or recovering. The machinery of the state, which had operated in defensive mode during the Cleveland Street scandal, now shifted into offensive mode. They could not cure him. They could not change him, but perhaps, they reasoned, they could shackle him. They needed a keeper, not a doctor, not a policeman, but someone who could be with him 24 hours a day, someone who could steer him, control him, and hide his flaws from the world. They needed a wife, but this wouldn't be a fairy tale romance. This would be a medical and political intervention disguised as a wedding. The search began for a woman who was strong enough to carry the dead weight of a dying prince, a woman whose spine was made of steel, who could stand in front of the slow mind and block the view of the public. Eddy, lost in his fog, likely had little say in the matter. He was a piece of driftwood caught in a current he couldn't see. He continued his nights of drinking and his days of staring, unaware that the final act of his tragic life was being scripted in the drawing rooms of Windsor Castle. The slow mind was about to be pushed onto the greatest stage of all, forced to play the role of the romantic lead in a play that was destined to end in a funeral. By the winter of 1891, the royal family had reached a breaking point. The strategy of containment, hiding Eddy in the army, sending him to India, burying his scandals in police vaults, had exhausted itself. You cannot hide the heir to the throne forever. Sooner or later, the curtain has to rise. And the Queen, Victoria, sitting in her black mourning weeds at Windsor or Balmoral, looked at the calendar with a growing sense of dread. She was old. The century was dying. And the boy who would one day wear her crown was, to put it bluntly, a disaster waiting to happen. The slow mind was drifting further into the fog. The whispers about his health were becoming louder than the official denials. It was time for the ultimate corrective measure, the one tool the monarchy had used for 1,000 years to fix a broken prince, a wedding ring. This wasn't about romance. In the high-stakes chess game of European royalty, romance was a luxury for the unimportant. For the future king, marriage was a structural reinforcement. They needed to find a woman who could act as a buttress to a crumbling wall. They needed someone with a spine of steel, an unshakable sense of duty, and, perhaps most importantly, the intelligence to do the thinking for two people. They didn't just need a wife, they needed a caretaker. The search was clinically precise. They scoured the almanacs of European royalty, dismissing the flighty, the fragile, and the Catholic. And finally, their gaze landed on a young woman who was, in many ways, the perfect anti-Eddy. Her name was Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known to her family as May. The cruelty of the establishment's solution was personified by their choice of bride, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known as May. She was technically a princess, yes, but in the brutal hierarchy of the court, she was a poor relation. Her father, the Duke of Teck, was a minor German noble with no money and a history of mental instability. Her family lived on the fringes of royal favor, always struggling to keep up appearances, always one unpaid bill away from embarrassment. May had grown up not in luxury, but in a kind of shabby, high-stress gentility. She had learned early to keep her back straight, her mouth shut, and her emotions locked in a vault deep inside her chest. She was serious, she was sharp, and she was desperate for security. To the Queen, she was a godsend. Here was a girl who had no other options, a girl who had been bred to serve, a girl who would not run away when she realized the prince was slow or difficult. She was the perfect sacrificial lamb to be fed to the dynastic machine, the machinery of the matchmaking ground into gear. Eddy, lethargic and pliant as ever, was steered towards her. He was told that May was the one. He, in his vague, amiable way, agreed. He wrote letters that were touching in their simplicity, expressing a hope that she would accept him. It is hard to know if he loved her, or if he even understood what love was. In a marital sense, he likely saw her as a raft in the middle of the ocean, something solid to cling to in the chaos of his life. For May, the proposal was a terrifying honor. She knew the rumors. Everyone knew the rumors. She knew she was marrying a man who was intellectually her inferior, a man with a dark cloud over his reputation. But she also knew that this was her duty. She was being offered the crown of England. She said yes. The engagement was announced in December 1891. The relief in the establishment was palpable. It felt like the entire British Empire exhaled at once. The newspapers, those same papers that had hinted at scandal just months before, now gushed with sentimental prose. They painted a picture of a love match, of a handsome prince settling down with a virtuous English rose. It was the perfect Victorian narrative. The prodigal son returns, finds a good woman, and is redeemed. Plans for the wedding were drawn up with frantic speed. It was set for February 27th, 1892. The date was circled in red ink in every diary in London. The straightening out was almost complete. Eddy would be married. He would produce an heir, hopefully one who took after his mother, and he would be managed quietly and efficiently by Queen May until he died. But history has a sense of irony that is almost cruel in its precision. January 1892 opened with a bitter, bone-chilling cold. A dense yellow fog settled over England, and with the fog came something else, the Russian flu. It was a brutal pandemic that was sweeping across Europe, killing over 1 million people. It didn't care about rank or title. It moved through the slums of Whitechapel and the corridors of Sandringham with equal ferocity. The royal family had gathered at Sandringham House in Norfolk for the birthday of Eddy's father, the Prince of Wales. It was supposed to be a celebration. The house was full of guests, the fires were roaring, and the mood was festive. But Eddy was not well. He had been complaining of feeling wretched for days. At a shooting party, observers noted that he looked ghastly, pale, shivering, his movements even slower than usual. He stood in the muddy fields, gun in hand, looking like a man who was already fading away. But the show had to go on. He dressed for dinner, he made conversation, he played the part. On January 7th, the collapse came. He was forced to leave the dinner table, his body trembling uncontrollably. He was put to bed, and the doctors were summoned. At first, they hoped it was just a bad cold, but the fever spiked. His breathing became ragged and shallow. The diagnosis was pneumonia, a common and often fatal complication of the influenza. For a healthy young man of 28, pneumonia was dangerous but survivable. But Eddy was not a healthy young man. We must remember the slow mind, the dissipation, the years of heavy smoking, and the looming shadow of the untreated syphilis. His immune system was a fortress, with the gates already smashed open. The virus tore through him. The atmosphere at Sandringham shifted from celebration to a vigil of terror. The house went silent. Servants moved in socks. The Queen, terrified of infection but desperate for news, waited by the telegraph at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Princess May, the fiancée who was supposed to be planning her wedding, found herself instead sitting by the bedside of a dying man. The reports from the sick room were harrowing. As the fever consumed his brain, Eddy began to deliriously rave. The perfect silence that the monarchy had fought so hard to maintain was broken by the shouts of a dying prince. He called out names. He shouted at people who weren't there. He muttered about his past, fragments of a life that had been so carefully hidden. Did he call out the names of the boys from Cleveland Street? Did he shout in fear of the shadows he saw in the corners of the room? The family, gathered around the bed, could only listen in horror and pray that the doctors and nurses would be discreet. For 6 days, he fought. It was a brutal, agonizing struggle for breath. His powerful chest heaved, his face turned blue from lack of oxygen. His parents, Bertie and Alexandra, were frantic. Alexandra, who loved Eddy with a fierce, blinding devotion that ignored all his faults, refused to leave his side. She held his hand, wiping the sweat from his brow, whispering to him in Danish, trying to anchor him to the world, but the anchor dragged. In the early hours of January 14th, 1892, the breathing changed. It became the death rattle, the terrifying sound of lungs filling with fluid. At 9:35 in the morning, with his hand in his mother's and his fiancée watching from the foot of the bed, Prince Albert Victor took his final shuddering breath. The slow mind finally stopped. The shock was total. The heir was dead. The wedding was canceled. The flags that were being prepared for the street parties were hastily dyed black. The nation plunged into a mourning that was deep and sincere. To the average Briton, this was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, the young lover dying weeks before his marriage. But inside the palace, the gears of the machine did not stop turning for a single second. Even as the body was being prepared for the coffin, the swap was being calculated. The monarchy is an institution that abhors a vacuum. Eddy was gone, but the crown remained. The line of succession had simply shifted one step to the left. The new heir was Eddy's younger brother, Prince George. George was everything Eddy was not. He was short, bearded, gruff, and entirely uncomplicated. He was a naval officer who loved strict schedules, collecting stamps and shooting birds. He had none of Eddy's charm, but he also had none of his demons. He was safe. He was solid. He was boring. He was exactly what they needed. But there was still the problem of Princess May. This is where the story becomes almost cold-blooded in its pragmatism. May had been vetted. She had been approved. She was the perfect queen in waiting. The establishment decided that they were not going to throw away such a valuable asset just because the groom had died. In a move that feels almost medieval to modern sensibilities, the family began to gently but firmly push May and George together. They were the two chief mourners. They grieved together. They read letters together, and the whispers began, "She was meant to be queen." The mourning period was observed with strict Victorian propriety, but barely a year after Eddy was lowered into the royal crypt at Windsor, the engagement was announced. Princess May would marry Prince George. The public, eager for a happy ending, ate it up. They saw it as a romantic destiny, the brother stepping in to care for the grieving fiancée. But look closer at the wedding photos from 1893. Look at May's face. It is the face of a survivor. She had done her duty. She had buried the slow prince and married the safe prince. She would go on to become Queen Mary, the iron matriarch who would guide the monarchy through the First World War and into the modern age. She never spoke of Eddy. She erased him from her life with the same efficiency that the state erased him from the records. Eddy's death was, in a terrible, unspoken way, the cleanest solution to the problem. The risk was gone. The potential for a king who was mad or blackmailed or embroiled in homosexual scandal was eliminated. The monarchy had self-corrected. The spare had replaced the heir, and the ship of state sailed on, leaving the wreckage of Prince Albert Victor to sink beneath the waves. But you cannot kill a ghost. Eddy was dead, but he refused to stay buried. The official story, the tragic death of a beloved prince, was too perfect, too neat. The people, especially in the dark corners of London, began to talk. Why did he die so quickly? Was it really the flu, or was it something else? Whispers of poison began to circulate. Had the Queen ordered it? Had the Prime Minister decided that the risk was too great? Had he been removed to save the throne? These rumors were unfounded, wild speculations, but they showed how little the public trusted the official narrative. And then, the darkest shadow of all began to detach itself from the walls of Whitechapel. The Jack the Ripper murders had stopped in 1888, 4 years before Eddy died. But in the vacuum left by his death, a connection began to be forged in the public imagination. The slow prince who haunted the East End. The prince with a secret life. The prince who had been protected by the police during the Cleveland street scandal. If the police would cover up a brothel for him, people asked, what else would they cover up? The death of Albert Victor did not end the story. In fact, it was the beginning of the myth. The man was gone, but the monster was being born. The silence that the family had worked so hard to maintain was about to be filled with the most horrific accusations in the history of the British Crown. The grave at Windsor was sealed, but the file on the Ripper Prince was just being opened. Death does not always bring peace. For Prince Albert Victor, death was merely the intermission before the second act of his life, an act where he would perform not as a prince, but as a monster. This is where history dissolves into myth, where the documented facts of police ledgers and court circulars are replaced by the dark, swirling fog of folklore. It is a transition that usually takes centuries, but for Eddy, it happened with terrifying speed. The man who was buried in the royal vault at Windsor in 1892 was a fragile, flawed, and somewhat pathetic figure. But the man who rose from that grave in the public imagination was a figure of pure Gothic horror. To understand how the slow mind became the leading suspect in the most famous murder mystery of all time, we have to go back to the autumn of 1888. This was the Autumn of Terror. In the space of a few months, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were butchered in the district of Whitechapel. Whitechapel was the shadow self of Imperial London. It was a place where the sun of the empire never seemed to shine, a labyrinth of filth, poverty, and desperation. It was less than 3 miles from Buckingham Palace, yet it might as well have been on another planet. When the murders began, they shocked the world not just because of their brutality, but because of their precision. The victims were not just killed, they were dismantled. Organs were removed, faces were obliterated. It was a kind of fury that suggested a deep, burning hatred, or perhaps a twisted kind of mission. At the time, the police were baffled. They chased Polish Jews, American sailors, and local lunatics. But in the pubs of the East End, a different whisper began to circulate. The working class, who looked at the police with deep suspicion, began to believe that the killer was a toff, a gentleman, someone with a carriage, someone with medical knowledge, someone who could walk through the blood-slicked streets without being stopped because he carried the aura of authority. For decades, this gentleman killer remained a nameless boogeyman. But as the years passed and the secrets of Eddy's life began to leak out, the Cleveland Street scandal, the syphilis, the cover-ups, the two narratives began to merge. The public looked at the timeline. They saw a prince who frequented the underground. They saw a royal physician, Sir William Gull, who moved in the shadows. They saw a police force that had proven it would destroy evidence to protect the crown. And slowly, terrifyingly, the pieces clicked into place. The most elaborate and compelling version of this theory emerged not in the 1890s, but in the 1970s. It was brought to light by a man named Joseph Sickert, the son of the famous Victorian painter Walter Sickert, and popularized by the author Stephen Knight in his book Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. It is a story so cinematic, so perfectly structured, that it has become the definitive conspiracy theory of the British monarchy. The story goes like this. Prince Eddy, in his wanderings through the London underworld, did not just visit brothels. He visited an artist's studio. He became friends with the painter Walter Sickert, a man who loved the grit and grime of the lower classes. In Sickert's studio, or perhaps in a sweet shop nearby, Eddy met a young woman. Her name was Annie Crook. She was a shop girl, working class, Catholic, and beautiful. For the slow prince who had spent his life surrounded by stiff, formal courtiers, Annie must have seemed like a creature from another world. She was real. She was warm. And fatally, she was unaware of the danger of loving a prince. According to the theory, they fell in love. But it wasn't just a fling. They were secretly married in a clandestine Catholic ceremony. And soon, Annie bore a child, a daughter named Alice Margaret. Pause for a moment and consider the implications of this. If true, this was not just a scandal. It was a constitutional nuclear bomb. A future king of England, the head of the Protestant Church, married to a Catholic commoner, it would have invalidated his succession. It would have triggered a revolution. The child, Alice, was a legitimate heir to the throne, born of a union that threatened the very existence of the House of Windsor. The theory posits that the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, the same man who managed the Cleveland Street cover-up, discovered the secret. He was horrified. He went to the Queen, and together the cold, pragmatic minds of the state decided that the problem had to be liquidated. The first step was the raid on the apartment where Annie lived. Eddy was dragged away back to the palace, back to the straightening out we discussed earlier. Annie was not so lucky. She was seized by the authorities and placed in the custody of Sir William Gull. Here, the theory takes a turn into pure horror. Gull, the Queen's physician, was not just a doctor. He was portrayed as a high-ranking Freemason, a man who believed that his duty to the order and the state superseded all moral laws. To silence Annie, he didn't kill her. He destroyed her mind. He performed a crude, brutal operation on her brain, rendering her insane, a gibbering wreck who would spend the rest of her life in a workhouse, unable to tell anyone that she had once been the wife of the future king. But there was a loose end. The baby, Alice, had been spirited away by the nanny, and there were witnesses. Annie Crook had friends. Specifically, she had friends who were prostitutes in Whitechapel, Mary Jane Kelly and her circle. These women knew the secret. They knew about the prince. They knew about the baby. And when times got hard, when the winter of 1888 began to bite and the gin money ran out, they made the fatal mistake of trying to blackmail the government. They thought they were playing a game of leverage. They didn't realize they were playing a game of extermination. The theory claims that the Whitechapel murders were not the work of a lone maniac. They were a state-sanctioned cleanup operation. Sir William Gull, aged and stroke-ridden but driven by a fanatical will, took to his private carriage. His coachman was John Netley. Together they hunted down the blackmailers, one by one. This explains, the theorists argue, why the killer was never caught. He wasn't caught because he was the system. Imagine the scene. A woman like Polly Nichols or Annie Chapman is standing on a dark corner. A carriage pulls up. The door opens. She sees an elderly, well-dressed gentleman. She doesn't see a threat. She sees a customer, or perhaps a doctor. She steps closer, and by the time she realizes the truth, it is too late. The brutality of the killings, the mutilations, is explained as Masonic ritual. The cutting of the throat from left to right, the removal of specific organs, the arrangement of the bodies. According to Stephen Knight, these were symbolic penalties for those who betrayed the secrets of the Freemasons. It was a warning written in blood on the cobblestones of London. Do not speak against the king. The Jews graffiti found on Goulston Street near one of the murder sites. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, is interpreted not as a misspelling of Jews, but as a reference to the three ruffians in Masonic mythology, Jubela, Jubilo, and Jubilum. The police erased the graffiti before sunrise, officially to prevent anti-Semitic riots, but in this conspiracy they erased it because it was a signature of the true culprit. And where was Eddy while his wife's friends were being slaughtered? In this version of the story, Eddy is a tragic pawn. He is locked away in the palace mourning his lost love, while the men in gray suits commit atrocities in his name. He is the motive, but not the executioner. The murders stop in November 1888 with the death of Mary Jane Kelly, the ringleader of the blackmailers, because the mission is complete. The witnesses are dead. The secret is safe. However, there is another, perhaps even darker variation of the Ripper myth. This one doesn't require a Masonic conspiracy or a secret baby. It simply requires a madman. In 1970, a British surgeon named Dr. Thomas Stowell published an article claiming that Jack the Ripper was a man of noble birth who had contracted syphilis and was driven to homicidal mania. He didn't name him, but he dropped enough clues that everyone knew he meant Prince Albert Victor. This is the Mad Prince theory. It strips away the romance of the secret marriage and leaves only the horror of disease. It suggests that Eddy, his brain eaten away by spirochetes, would slip out of the palace at night. He would travel to the East End, the place where he felt most at home, and there, in a fugue state of sexual violence and psychotic rage, he would hunt. It paints a picture of a Jekyll and Hyde figure. By day, the lethargic, slow-minded prince, nodding off at tea parties. By night, a frenzy of knife work and bloodlust. In this version, the royal family and the police eventually realized what he was doing. They couldn't arrest him. You cannot arrest the heir. So they confined him. They drugged him. And eventually, in 1892, they let him die, or perhaps helped him along to stop the nightmare. Why do these stories persist? Why, despite all the evidence to the contrary? Do we want to believe that Prince Eddy was Jack the Ripper? The facts, however, reveal the sheer scale of the fabrication. The historical record is actually quite clear. On the nights of the murders, Prince Albert Victor was hundreds of miles away. The court circulars, the diaries, the guest lists, they all place him in Yorkshire or Scotland or Sandringham. Unless he had a teleportation device, he physically could not have been in Whitechapel. As for Sir William Gull, he was in his 70s. He had suffered a severe stroke in 1887 that left him partially paralyzed. The idea of this frail old man wrestling healthy East End women to the ground and performing complex surgery in pitch-black alleyways is physically impossible, and yet the story refuses to die. It has been made into films, graphic novels, and TV shows. It persists because it is mythically perfect. It resolves the central tension of the Victorian age. The Victorians preached a gospel of high morality, civilization, and progress. Yet they presided over a society of crushing inequality, where the rich lived in gold-plated splendor and the poor rotted in slums. The Ripper murders were the moment when the mask slipped. They showed the savagery beneath the civilization. By making the prince the killer or the cause of the killings, we are saying something profound about the nature of power. We are saying that the rot starts at the head. We are saying that the civilized rulers are actually the savages. It validates the suffering of the poor. It says we were right to be afraid of them. We were right to suspect them. It also gives Eddy a strange kind of agency. In life, he was the slow mind, a man who had things done to him. He was sent to the army, sent to India, sent to a bride. He was passive. But as Jack the Ripper, he is active. He is powerful. He is terrifying. In a twisted way, the conspiracy theory grants him the power that his own life denied him. It transforms him from a pathetic failure into the ultimate villain. The royal conspiracy is a story about the ultimate abuse of power. It posits that the state is a machine that will eat its own citizens to protect its figurehead. And the tragedy is that while the Ripper story is almost certainly fiction, the premise is based on fact. We know they covered up Cleveland Street. We know they silenced witnesses. We know they put the reputation of the prince above the law. The leap from covering up a brothel to covering up a murder is a leap of imagination, but it is not a leap of logic. It is the same logic, just dialed up to a scream. So Eddy lies in his tomb, trapped forever in this duality. To the historians, he is the sad, syphilitic, slow-witted prince who died too young. But to the world, he is the man in the cloak. He is the shadow in the fog. He is the monster who preyed on the women of Whitechapel. The perfect silence that the queen and her ministers tried to create around him failed spectacularly. Instead of silence, they got a scream that has echoed for 130 years. They tried to erase his scandals, and in doing so, they created a blank canvas onto which the world painted its darkest nightmares. The story of Prince Albert Victor does not end with a funeral. It ends with a question mark carved into the very stones of London. Did he do it? Almost certainly not, but could they have done it for him? That is the question that keeps the legend alive. What is the legacy of a man who was never allowed to be himself? A man who was merely a vessel for the anxieties of an empire? The prince is dead, but the ghost is very much alive. The story of Prince Albert Victor does not end with the conspiracy theories. It ends with silence. A silence so profound, so deliberately manufactured, that it feels less like an absence of noise and more like a physical weight. In the days and weeks following his death in 1892, a new operation began. It was not a medical operation nor a police raid. It was an operation of memory. The royal family, specifically his mother, Princess Alexandra, and the royal household, began the systematic process of curating the life of the late prince. At Sandringham, the air was thick with smoke. The house, usually bustling with guests, was draped in the heavy, suffocating gloom of Victorian morning. In the private sitting rooms, the fireplaces were lit, not for warmth, but for destruction. Princess Alexandra, broken by grief, could not bear to part with her son's memory, yet she could not risk his reality surviving. She began to burn his letters. This was not a small task. Eddy was a prolific, if simple, correspondent. He wrote to his mother constantly. He wrote to his friends. He wrote to the men he had known in the army and the underground. Thousands of pages of handwriting, spidery, ill-formed, revealing the chaotic inner world of the slow mind, were fed into the flames. Why? Ostensibly, it was an act of privacy. The Victorians believed that the private thoughts of the great and good should remain private. But there was a sharper, more desperate edge to this bonfire. Alexandra and the courtiers knew what was in those letters. They knew the names he mentioned. They knew the unguarded confessions of loneliness, of desire, of confusion. They knew that if these papers ever fell into the hands of the press, or even future historians, the image of the golden youth they were trying to construct would be shattered. So the history of Prince Albert Victor went up the chimney. We lost his voice. We lost his perspective. We lost the ability to judge him by his own words. Instead, we were left with the official version, a saintly, tragic figure, our darling Eddy, who was too pure for this wicked world. But the erasure went deeper than just letters. The official archives were purged. As we touched upon earlier, the police files relating to the Cleveland Street scandal, the critical depositions that named PAV disappeared from the Public Record Office. They didn't just get misplaced, they were extracted. It was a surgical removal of a tumor that threatened the body politic. This is the perfect silence in its final form. It is the silence of the archive. The establishment decided that for the monarchy to survive, Eddy had to cease to be a person and become a symbol. He became a tragic portrait on a commemorative mug. He became a name on a hospital wing. But the man, the flesh and blood man who drank and suffered and loved men and drifted through the fog, was erased. But a terrifying question remains. What if he had lived? If the influenza had spared him, Albert Victor would have become king in 1910 upon the death of his father, Edward VII. He would have been King Albert I during the most volatile period in modern human history. Picture the scene. The year is 1914. Europe is a powder keg. The intricate web of alliances between Britain, Germany, and Russia is straining to the breaking point. The world is sliding toward the catastrophe of the First World War. And at the helm of the British Empire sits the slow mind. Imagine Eddy, with his apathy, his lack of focus, and his pliability, sitting across the table from the Kaiser or the Tsar. Imagine him trying to navigate the complexities of the Irish Home Rule crisis or the rise of the labor movement. Historians almost unanimously agree that a King Eddy reign would have been a disaster. He was easily led. He would have been a puppet for whatever strong personality was currently whispering in his ear, be it a wife, a minister, or a favorite. The monarchy, which relies on the illusion of stability, might have cracked under the weight of his incompetence. In the crucible of World War I, when the Russian monarchy collapsed and the German monarchy fell, the British monarchy survived in large part because George V, Eddy's boring, steady younger brother, was at the helm. George was not brilliant, but he was disciplined. He knew how to rebrand the family. He changed their name from the German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the English Windsor. He visited the troops. He held the line. Could Eddy have done that? Could the man who fell asleep at dinner parties have rallied a nation through the Somme? It is unlikely. There is a very real possibility that if Eddy had lived, the British Revolution would have happened in 1917 alongside the Russian one. The House of Windsor might have ended before it even began. So in a dark, twisted way, his death was the greatest gift he ever gave his country. He died so the institution could live. He was the sacrificial lamb in the truest sense. But this political calculation offers no comfort to the man himself. As we look back on his life from the vantage point of the 21st century, the figure of Prince Albert Victor evokes a complex mixture of pity and horror. For 100 years he was a punchline, the collar and cuffs, the idiot prince. Then he became a villain, Jack the Ripper, the monster. Only now, as we begin to understand the nuances of mental health, of learning disabilities, and of the brutal pressures of the Victorian closet, can we start to see him clearly. He was a victim. He was a victim of biology, born with a mind that didn't fit the mold and a body that may have betrayed him with disease. He was a victim of his class, trapped in a gilded cage where his every move was watched, where he was denied the right to love who he wanted or be who he was. He was a victim of his family, loved, yes, but also managed, suppressed, and ultimately replaced. The tragedy of the slow mind is that he was never allowed to be just Eddy. He always had to be the prince, and the prince was a role he was incapable of playing. Today, if you visit Windsor Castle, you can see his tomb in the Albert Memorial Chapel. It is one of the most magnificent examples of Art Nouveau sculpture in existence. His effigy lies in repose, dressed in the uniform of the 10th Hussars. Above him an angel bends down, holding a crown of glory, offering him the peace in death that he never found in life. It is beautiful, it is moving, and it is a lie. The stone prince is serene. The real prince was a chaotic mess of fear and desire. The stone prince is a hero. The real prince was a liability. But as you stand there, in the quiet of the chapel, you can almost hear the echo of the perfect silence. It is the sound of a story that was strangled. It is the sound of a man screaming underwater. Prince Albert Victor remains the great what-if of the British monarchy. He is the shadow that stands behind every king and queen that followed. He is the reminder that the crown is heavy and it crushes the weak. His life was a scandal. His death was a cover-up. His legacy is a ghost story. And in the end, perhaps that is the only legacy the system would allow him to have. The man is gone. The mystery remains. And the silence is perfect. History is not just about what happened. It is about what we choose to remember. We chose to forget Eddy the man and remember Eddy the monster or Eddy the tragedy. But somewhere in the fog of 1890s London, in a dimly lit room on Cleveland Street, or in a carriage rattling through the rain, there was a human being. A man who likely knew he was dying. A man who knew he didn't fit. A man who was terrified of the throne that awaited him. We should not remember him as Jack the Ripper. That is a fantasy we created to entertain ourselves. We should remember him as the ultimate casualty of the royal machine. He was a man who was ground down into dust so that the pavement could be smooth for the rest of us to walk on. The empire is gone. The fog has lifted. But Prince Albert Victor is still there, waiting in the dark. The prince who never was, the king who never reigned, the slow mind that was silenced forever.